The third text we'll be looking at this in this module is an excerpt from Epicurus' letter to Menoicus. And Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher. Came along a little after Plato. And this text, which is really one of the most amazing things ever written, I think, in the history of philosophy on the subject of death, is can be seen as an absolute contrast to the view of what death is, the theory of death that comes from Plato, and I suppose by extension that comes from the Bhagavad Gita, an entirely different view. And what I find quite interesting, especially with regard to Plato, is to look at the length of this work, or at least what the part of this work that actually specifically has to do with death, which is really only a few sentences, and compare it or contrast it with the Phaedo, which I've just given you a short excerpt, which is a very long dialogue. That is, this view of death, Epicurus thought, could be expressed in a very short space, whereas what Plato is doing, at least in his own mind, required a much longer work. But let's look at what Epicurus actually has to say about death. He says, accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to us. For good and evil imply awareness, and death is a privation of all awareness. Remember, the privation. That word is a tricky word because we often hear it differently, but privation means the depriving of, the absolutely, the taking away of, and the privation of all awareness, the taking away of all awareness. And right there, we already have a theory of death. What is death? It's the privation of all awareness. And we might supplement that by saying the permanent and irrevocable privation, taking away of all awareness. That is what death is. It's the permanent, absolute taking away of all consciousness, all awareness, all mental activity of all sorts. Therefore, a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life, that is, the fact that we do not last forever, that we are mortal, enjoyable, not by adding to life an unlimited time, but by taking away the yearning after immortality. That is, on this view that death is just the ending of all consciousness. Epicurus says this means that there's nothing to fear, that there's no reason to yearn for immortality because there's no reason to be afraid of death. He continues by saying, make this a little bigger, for life has no terror, right here. Life has no terror for those who thoroughly apprehend that there are no terrors for them in ceasing to live. It is. What he says, foolish, therefore, is the person who says that he fears death, not because it will pain when it comes, but because it pains in the prospect. There's no reason to be afraid of death. Death is simply the end of all feeling, of all awareness. Death is neither good nor bad for us. It's nothing. It's literally nothing. In order for something to be good for bad or bad for us, we have to be aware of it, and we're not aware of death because death is the end of all awareness. Whatever causes no annoyance when it is present causes only a groundless pain in the expectation. Death, therefore, the most awful of evils, and he's being ironic there clearly when he says that it's the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not. It is nothing then, either to the living or to the dead, for with the living it is not, and the dead exist no longer. There is no point at which we meet death. When we are, that is, when we are alive, when we exist, that means that death has not yet come. And when death has come, and it will, that means we no longer exist. So there's no point at which we experience death, or there's no point at which death is part of our lives. There's this absolute disjunction between being something, being alive, and being dead. There's no in-between point in which we might experience something terrible. There's dying, I mean, there's the process of heading towards death, and Epicurus could never dismiss that. But dying is a part of life. To say that someone's dying is to logically imply that they are alive. They are not dead. So that is part of life. And I would say that if the experiences of dying leading up to death are painful, then that is something that to legitimately fear. But death itself, no, because death is simply the privation of all awareness. Now, this is quite something, I think, in terms of a view of death, and it is something certainly that jibes with a certain just as Plato and Bhagavad Gita may jibe with pre-existing intuitions we have about death. Certainly, this one does too. But it is an entirely different view of death, and you can say that its assumptions, its starting points, let's say, in its conception of death, aren't so different from Plato's. That couldn't help but be different. Plato's starting point is that death is the separation of soul and body. And then he explores everything, all the complications having to do with that basic assumption. Epicurus's basic assumption, his starting point, is that death is the privation of all awareness. Now, it may seem quite simple, and maybe it is quite simple, Epicurus's view, but I can tell you from experience, having maybe followed out some of the consequences of that, it's not as simple as it appears. But again, the fact that Epicurus could say pretty much everything he has to say about death in a few sentences, as opposed to Plato's long dialogue, really does show that there's a difference. I mean, in the sense that if Plato is going to try to prove that the soul can exist without body, something that Epicurus would never, under this view, never accept as even as a possibility. That Plato trying to prove that takes a lot of philosophical effort, where it does seem that Epicurus's view does jibe at least with what appears on the surface to be true about death, and that is death is the absolute end of the person in all the person's aspects. There's no part of us that goes on. There's no survival of death in Epicurus. It's entirely mortality is the absolute end, and we are finite beings insofar as we are limited. That we exist between birth and death, and only between birth and death, with no sense of an afterlife or beyond. An entirely different theory of death than, I would say, both the other two texts we've been looking at.